Hello everyone, Sula here with another big adventure. In this episode, I'm going to be making a time lapse of the full moon rising. Y'all know how I love time lapses, and I've been trying to make a time lapse of the full moon rising all year long. And every time something has gone wrong. In June, I tried to make a time lapse of the total lunar eclipse over the iconic Golden Gate Bridge, and I guess a lot of people had the same idea. Also, there were a lot of clouds. In addition, although the Marin Headlands scenic overlooks allegedly closed at sunset, for some reason multiple cars came by and shined their headlamps into my camera, and so that one didn't work out at all. In July, I did get some footage, but my settings were all wrong and everyone thought that it was the sun rising. And then in August, I also went to a scenic location and I did get some footage, but there were a lot of clouds and it didn't look that great either. It looked okay, but then in September, I wanted to get the harvest moon rising over the bay, and there were so many clouds I couldn't even see the moon. So now it's the full moon today. It's the hunter's moon, which is apropos for Montana since it's hunting season. And I hope no one mistakes these tripods for a rifle and thinks that I'm out here trying to poach and illegally hunt on private property. But so far, no one's bothered me. And so let me tell you what equipment I'm using and my settings. This tripod has a crop sensor Sony camera with a 100 to 400 millimeter zoom lens, and it's zoomed out to 400, and it has a 1.4 time teleconverter, and with the crop sensor it has a 1.5 time crop factor, so it's 840 millimeters. And at that focal length, it can only go down to f8. So this camera will be 840 millimeters, f8, and 1/10 shutter speed, and 200 ISO. Over here on this other tripod, I have a full frame Sony camera with a 240 millimeter zoom lens. At 240 millimeters, it can go down to f6.3, so I'm going to use f6.3, and I'm going to use 1/20 as my shutter speed on this one, and 400 ISO. Why do I have two cameras going? Well, I guess you could say that one's a safety valve in case something goes wrong, but actually the reason is that you may have seen time lapses of full moon rising and the moon looks enormous, and the way they do that is they take two time lapses and they blend them so that one of them is sort of like what you do with the Milky Way. You take a Milky Way and then you take a foreground and you blend them. Well, they blend one with a giant zoom with one that's not so zoomed, and that makes the moon look even bigger than it is on a full moon night. I've never done that before, but I hope to do it. And if I get one good time lapse, I'll be very happy. If I get two good time lapses, I'll be extremely happy. And if I get two good time lapses and I'm able to blend them into one, well then I'll be over the moon. So I need to pay attention and make sure I don't make any mistakes. So I'm going to tend to my cameras. I have to make sure they're focused. You need to do that while there's still some light out, because it's very hard to do once it gets dark and you're trying to predict, exactly being focused far away before the moon even comes up. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to focus on the distant peak, and then I'm going to get them going. Once the moon comes up, it happens very fast. It moves out of the frame at these focal lengths within maybe 7 to 10 minutes, and then you only get a 10-second time lapse out of that. But hopefully all will go well, and I'll check in with you later. All systems go. I think it's gonna be a successful evening. Hoo-hoo! Just saw a whole bunch of elk. I just saw a whole bunch of elk over there. I think I was successful. Now it's time to go in and process them. Well, finally, after numerous failed attempts this year at getting a full moonrise time lapse, I finally got one with the hunter's moon. And now I'm going to show you how to make a time lapse using Photoshop. And if you're not interested in that, you can just fast forward past this part to see my final result. I'm not going to show you how I blended it because I blended it using Premiere Pro, which is my video editing software. And if you think Photoshop is expensive, try getting the entire Creative Cloud Suite subscription. But it's important to me and I use it every day, so I have it. But anyway, here's how to make a time lapse in Photoshop. Now we're going to make a time lapse in Photoshop. I already put the files in this folder and here they are. And so Control A to select all of them and drag them up to the top of Photoshop. And then it will load all of them in Photoshop and it'll send them into Adobe Camera Raw. Then we're going to make changes to the pictures similar to what we did with the Milky Way picture. Unfortunately, you can't, it can only change the whole thing. I can't put different changes at different spots because, it gets brighter as the moon gets higher, but I'm just going to go to the middle because that's probably representative of most of them. And so just like with the Milky Way, first thing we're going to do in Adobe Camera Raw is remove Chromatic Aberration and Lens Profile Correction. And then we're going to go into detail and put some noise reduction in at 50, and in the sharpening put the masking up to 35. And then we're going to go into the basic panel, and here we need to recover the shadows, but the moon is way too bright, and so we have to reduce the highlights to make it look like the moon instead of the sun. And need to increase the blacks and the whites a little bit, and it should be a little bit yellowish. So I'm going to change the temperature. That looks more realistic. About right there, and give it some clarity and a little bit of dehaze, not too much. I think I need to maybe increase the shadows even more. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Yeah, just pump it all the way up to 100. Yeah. Okay, and then give it some little bit of dehaze, not too much. And then a little bit of vibrance and some saturation. And that looks pretty good to me. And so then you right-click and copy edit settings. Then Control A to select all, and then paste edit settings. And then you go up here to the top right where there's an arrow pointing down, and you click on that and you save it in a different folder. I have a temporary folder where I put the files after I do this, and name it something. moonrise test. And then you give it a 6-digit serial number, and it has to start with 0, and you can either save it as a TIFF or a JPEG. If you save it as a TIFF, you can make further changes even after you make it into the time lapse by putting a layer on top of it. And then everything else is fine, so you just hit save, and it's going to take a very long time because it was 433 pictures. And there's a bar down here at the lower left corner that'll show the progress. So be back in a minute. Alrighty, Adobe Camera Raw is finished making those into a sequence. So you just hit done in the bottom right hand corner, and then you wait for it, and then you go to Photoshop, and you click File, Open, and there's the folder that I put them in. And so you just click the first picture, and you click this button, Image Sequence, and then you say Open. And I always make the frame rate 24 because I always film in 24 frames per second, so say OK. And make this a little bit bigger. And there's the time lapse in Photoshop. But it's gigantic. It doesn't look gigantic, but it is gigantic. And so you have to resize it. And so I don't know why it's so blue, but that's okay. The sky is blue, and people like to see a blue sky. So anyway, you resize it, and I'm going to resize it to 4K because I always film in 4K. So that's 3840 for the width. Hit OK. It'll convert to a smart object. Okay, then click Convert, and then go to Canvas size, and that will be 2160 because that's the size of 4K. Then say OK, and it's going to make the canvas size. Just hit Proceed, and now you have to render it. You could play it now, but because it hasn't rendered, it would be extremely slow. So I'm not going to do that yet. You hit this button down here in the bottom left-hand corner that's a warped arrow, and now it's going to render, and give it a name. Doesn't matter. Moonrise in October. Let's see, it's going to save that in my time-lapse folder. And then you click Render. Sorry about that. And then it's going to take a minute to export it. One moment, please. Okay, I finished exporting. Now I'll go to my file where I saved it and play it back. Look at that. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so that is the hunter moon rising over the mountains. And that's how you make a time lapse in Photoshop. Bye-bye. Well, that concludes this episode. I hope you liked my full moonrise time lapses because I sure spent a lot of time making them. I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, get outside and